From the Annual Association for the Study of High Capacities and Giftedness, we want to welcome you to this second series of international conferences, Positive Synergies on High Capacities and Giftedness in Times of Crisis, COVID-19. This year, talking about the consequences of non-identification. It's my pleasure today to introduce you to Francisco José Camarero Suárez, called Interaction between Cognitive Capacity, High Sensitivity and Compensation Systems in the Brain. Francisco José Camarero Suárez holds a PhD in psychology for the University of Oviedo and works in the High Capacities Regional Team in Asturias, working with kids with special needs and special support needs. I hope you enjoy it. Good. Hello from Asturias. My name is Francisco Camarero and I work in the unit for high capacities in the regional team in the Principality of Asturias. First of all, I would like to thank the Annual Association for having invited me to this Congress on identification of kids with high capacities. Without further ado, I will introduce my talk where I try to give a theoretical framework of the compliance of indicators that are relevant when identifying high capacities. Thank you very much to all of you, and I hope you enjoy it. My work in the high capacity unit is connected to the attention of all the public centers and public and private centers with public support in Asturias, both in initial education in primary and preschool, primary and secondary school. We work after requests that teachers send to us, specifically tutors to the kids, to help them identifying these students when having to choose the appropriate educational measures. It's a beautiful work, very complex too, where we're supposed to add in this collaboration with the services that the Principality of Asturias gives. This is not easy. There is lots of information, but there are also gaps, and there's doubts, and there's different opinions in the approach of high capacities from the different bodies. These different opinions have, at the end, a negative effect on the students, on the work that we do, and the expectations from of the families, and how to help teachers work with the kids. I have been working for over 17 years in a different unit in the regional team too, with behavioral disorder units, and I 3 years ago started in this unit full of energy and connecting with my previous job, with my PhD studies and the different studies that I taught on cognitive processing of information, the different learning styles, different academic variations. I've always found the objective of finding the root of those behaviors and the root of the problems. This can allow us a better approach and a better search for solutions in these situations. With this aim, when we get to high capacities, as they are currently, I see that rather than an explanatory model, we have many descriptive models. Literature often talks about high capacities and giftedness, and they often make the mistake of describing with lots of indicators and standards of what high capacities would be. And that leads us to the professionals and the teachers to identify some stereotypes of what high-capacity students should be. I think this is derived from the lack of a theoretical framework that can compile a set of characteristics, general characteristics, that can include all these indicators when defining high capacities. And with this objective is where we are now. I know that from the year of the 90s, we have studied Renzulli's model, where there were three big spheres, that he used more, rather than for identification, for the work with these kind of students. High capacity, sphere, creativity, and persistence in the task, associating these spheres and the connection between those spheres to identification of those high capacities. But I believe that programs to improve their performance, working on these spheres is one thing, but another different thing is to try to understand what are the peculiarities of the students and what happens with students when with those students that are to the east of the Gauss belt. Well, first we need to take perspective. And we can't lose perspective from this. We are millions of kilometers away from Earth. We see a little white spot there. We are under the rings of Saturn. And here, what we see, and I think of Piaget, when talking about organization, and we're thinking about life and everything around us, and we talk about evolution and adapting to the environment, and we can see the different shapes in the different brains. And there is a development, a type of human being, Homo sapiens sapiens, that's human being, and we know that we know. And that's going to be the root of this singularity, the man who knows, or the human who knows that knows. We can define high capacities in different ways, but it's clear that there is an exceptional potential. And this efficiency in execution has a neurobiopsychological basis. And I understand this basis as an interaction between cognition, high sensitivity, and motivation. And in motivation, there are many studies connected to the physiological relation between the system of awards, the brain award system. Now let's get a bit further into detail. When we're studying this interaction, and when I've been seeing, when reviewing literature and working with hundreds of cases, I've somehow developed an Occam work. I've eliminated everything that was not giving me an answer to what I was looking for, and I've kept the basics. I've kept the Robert Stempel cognitive efficiency that he studied in the 70s, and then he delimited in the year 2000, and in his book, Further Away from IQ, we found a location of intuitive and creative thought, giving some very interesting perspective to these students, these people. Because we are going to see that IQ tests are not so accurate when looking for something that has not been assessed. On the other hand, people with high sensitivity, that's a different concept that Giacomo defined, and Karina Siegels also studies in the year 2019, based on some pillars that, according to these two authors, represents between 50 and 20% of the population. I was very curious about this feature because if I analyze the studies on high capacities and the connection between high capacity and high sensitivity, we see that further to a typical deviation from the average, there's a 93% of this population presents these 4 pillars of high sensitivity. It's a very specific, very correct indicator to study high capacities. And the other factor that I have studied is persistence in the task, looking for novelty. There were certain conditions, and they still are, that makes them special when keeping attention and persistence and achievement of their objective. And this has a physiological connection. In a meta-analysis that Isabel Gómez León did in 2020 with 42 current studies with kids with less than 5 years of age, connecting the compensation system of the brain and the presence of dopamine in the brain with high capacities. And of course, we have found a positive relation. So we could be facing the real answer to that inner motivation that these students show. Everything that will be said in this talk on high capacities has to be also connected to diversity. We have here a population, and there's a chart here representing the average of this population and certain typical deviations. We see to the left typical deviations that don't reach the average figures, and to the right those that go further. We would see that high capacity would be in a typical deviation over the average, or 2 deviations if we're talking about giftedness. But this can lead us to mistake, to an error, because we can say, oh, gifted students will be to the east of the chart, to the right of the chart. And here we find the characteristic of a student that we can consider to have high capacities. But what happens if, following Javier Turón, the professor Javier Turón, it was saying that if we take this side of the chart and we develop assessment techniques, we see another bell, because we find exactly the same diversity with the same average figures and typical deviations. And if we take, to make sure within this subgroup, the population with 1 or 2 typical deviations with regards to the average, and we do the test, we hold the test again, we find another bell, because there's very high diversity within these populations, and our features and our tools, statistical tools, are very much limited when trying to define exactly the features of a very specific population. So whatever we say, it's possible in a percentage of cases. I hope we will be explaining more and more percentages of cases, but it won't be everyone. Intellectual high capacities talk to us about a potential, an exceptional potential, and a learning capacity, efficiency, and there's a neurological basis with a set of processes and capacities when acquiring, perfectioning, and consolidating of the information. And this would lead us to eminence when we're talking about individuals that we could consider complex talents or academic talents, etc. How does learning capacity, cognitive capacity work then? In the 90s, information processing systems showed us that there were different phases that as a circle would work to receive information, to understand it, and to express it. So we can see that the brain works as receiver of the information, and that reception of the information has to do with sensitivity processes. The sensors, the senses absorb the information, transfer it to us, and we pay attention to that. Then, once this information enters, there's a set of processes that transform. Jesús Beltrán defined in his book, grouping it in understanding processes, and maintaining processes, the techniques that they would use to keep and maintain that information. And talking about memory, we should also listen to some recovery systems where we have information that is recalled from previous situations or that is being transferred to new contexts. What will matter most to us, it could be other processes, though. Some processes that Brown, Campione worked very much, even Magnier and more known authors, on the metacognitive processes. These general processes would be two different types, and they have to do with knowledge and control. When we studied this in the 90s, we allocated certain characteristics to these processes, and they had to do with controlling the task, control and supervision of what we were doing, with knowing myself, what I'm expected to do, the objectives, and the strategies that we were going to put in place. Nowadays, I think psychology, our current psychology, has let some space for the mind psychology, the one developed in the East. We're talking about the observer. When we're talking about metacognitive processes, thinking about what we're thinking, assess what we're assessing, we're talking about the witness, about the observation, about the person who knows that knows. The person thinking is not just a set of thoughts, a random set of thoughts in the brain. There's one part of that mind that allows to observe that mind, to see how that information is entering in the brain, in the mind, how that mind is connecting that knowledge to others. That witness of what is happening in the mind would be what in the Western psychology was considered metacognitive processes. It would be what Steiner would call global processes. Local processes, where automatizing of these processes would allow to pay more attention towards how I'm doing the projects, the tasks that I want. You should also know that any of these processes is a circle. This process is going non-stop. It's going connected, constantly connected. Sternberg in the 90s gives us a clue with his triarchic theory of intelligence. The difference between slow development of the intelligence and talent is not that far away. Even the definition of intelligence in the 80s, many of the questions that we came with, it was, what is intelligence? Well, what the IQ tests measure. That's, well, a very simple way of explaining something that is really complex. We're not only talking about learning, it's not just about humans, it's also about animals, the intelligence of forests too. So Sternberg is telling us there's not just a difference in the quantity, there's also other elements. We see that there are competences that fail when intellectual development is not done. So when we're talking about fluid intelligence, we don't reach to have some general principles, and we don't see how they end up developing their phenomena that we do see in the result of the knowledge, the crystallized intelligence. And it's there in the crystallized intelligence where Sternberg would find the reasons to certain differences. We can think that here is where the components that amplify the differences are. In talent, we find an extraordinary experiential system where there are two characteristics that are essential. One, development of the processes for learning are much more automatized. They can work in a parallel way. We can be working in a parallel way while we're choosing selection of information, we're coordinating, we're developing associations and connections. And on the other hand, we find talent in a great ability to face novelty, a very flexible mind, and that would be one of the characteristics of the creative and talented mind. And with this ability to face novelty, there's a key element, the insight. It's a set of unconscious skips or jumps of thoughts that end up being abilities to respond to that novelty. These aha abilities, this insight, they're processes to receive the information when coding selectively that information, when separating what is relevant and what isn't, and what is a novelty and what they set as an objective, a combination of those relevant elements and a comparison with their models that we have in our memory with previous experiences. We find analogies between what we already know, what we want to learn. So Sternberg talks to us about an intuitive thought that is very different to those local or global processes to elaborate that we were mentioning at the beginning. So we've got relevance coding processes. Here we can see a drawing with a metaphor of what it would be to choose within the information those elements that are relevant to us. In this card, we see that there are different colored dots, and those would be the ones we allocate to give that information the relevance capacity. Once we've coded, we don't only pay attention to that is interesting to solve the task, but we combine those different aspects and we create networks and models when making this selective combination. And once we have those models, we compare them in time with previous experiences, with networks and models that we have already designed. And what do we get here? Well, a change in a global combination. And this evolution is what gives us a better efficiency to the new models that will be compared to the previous ones. Yes, there is a progress with the people, and qualitative and quantitative progress in people with high capacities. We've got some mnemic structures, knowledge structures, that are much more complex than in situations where these processes are not so clearly developed. These are super awareness processes where you can review what we are reviewing. So we're reviewing the model that we're learning with previous models. We're comparing when we are aware of the differences. The best way of seeing this is with examples that are used even for the assessment of this type of thoughts. You will be able to solve these examples little by little because it's a video, but this is a task that I usually present to my students. And it has to do with these coding processes, or selective coding or combination processes. So, the first example, if the example is an activity where we're talking about selective coding, pay attention to the relevant information to solve it. The following examples, you don't only need to code the information, but you also need to combine that information and say how we have to implement previous models to solve these new tasks. And the last one, it's a trap model, because it's probably the best way of noticing that insight element, that constant. It's something that happens to us in all the processes. We go and take the car keys and we say, oh, but I need to take first my wallet. And so we connect thoughts and we think about the elements that we're going to be needing. Your mind is aware that something is happening. That is our insight. And as we develop these intuition capacities of the needs, of the relations, the complex relations that are set in the memory and the recall models, we will be talking about a higher learning capacity. The second pillar that we walk would be the high sensitivity related with giftedness. Elaine Aron in 2017 also worked with Karina Thegers, and they talk about 4 pillars. This information is very useful for me when I'm studying identification of the features of high capacities in my students, especially when working with families, because this is something that probably we cannot see so clearly in a regular questionnaire through the tutor of the students or through the student. But when asking direct questions to the families, we do see all these experiences from their the birth of that baby to their current age. That can be in the first, sixth year of primary, secondary, and they do identify these indicators. Firstly, these students show high sensitivity and they show a high percentage, 15 or 20% of the population and 93% of the total of the population with high capacities. They have a very intense way and very deep way of processing the information that they have received. And I tell them there are students that just don't accept any answer. They keep asking you over and over again, because what you've told me, why is this? Why this so? That intensity, that need to go deeper into topics. And as we have already analyzed, it has very much to do with a deeper coding, a deeper relevant selection of information, but also connecting with other topics and making other connection and relations, changes in the model that continue to be assessed. And the parents notice, yes, that their kids have this depth of processing. They don't just accept anything, they try to go deep down until they really go deep and see the root of it. The next pillar would be overstimulation, and it's very, very common in this population of high capacities. As a consequence of this deep processing feature, there is a deep management too that produces an overstimulation, not only of what they're learning, but also of what they're learning about what they're thinking about what they're learning. So there's an overload, sometimes there's an overstimulation. It's a lot of information, not only information coming from their senses, but also cognitive information that they are managing constantly, because their memory processes approach in phases. They overflood the thoughts, their memories, that privileged memory that we can observe in many of them. And all this is information of the external outside world and also of their inner world. And all this information involves an overload, an overstimulation. Third pillar that the author explains to us is emotion. Very intense emotions. And very much connected to a capacity to perceive the emotions of those around them. That's what we call empathy. And it comes to a point, and sometimes I ask their parents, when you see your kids observing something that is not fair, or you observe someone suffering, the kids suffer even more than that person does. Yes, because in those mirror brain cells, all the feeling they're observing is reflected, and it makes them feel that same suffering. Because learning process is very much connected to external experience, and it comes to a point in which you almost feel the same, being you the participating subject, as if you were the observing subject. And there, to finish, the fourth pillar, and there are some differences in the population, but there is a very important element. If we don't have this component, we're not talking about high sensitivity, we're talking about something else. They have a high sensitivity in all their senses, and they perceive very subtle elements that are not perceived by other people in the populations. They have a special radar to subtle elements in all their organs. We're talking about vision, or colors, in distance, in brightness. They find it disturbing. Very bright lights are disturbing. Loud noises are very disturbing. We see kids that cover their ears because it hurts. Hearing over stimulation, or maybe with the touch, with the feeling, the type of the type of clothes they're wearing. All these things that are very subtle for them is much more intense. It's very highly developed, so it has a very important repercussion. And with all this, we build these 4 pillars that would be the characteristics of the high sensitivity. Now we would need to imagine what happens when you connect intuitive thought, that creative thought, with that originality, with that flow, with that mental flexibility, with this high sensitivity. Now let's see what happens. Implications of the high sensitivity. And following Karina Segers, in her book, People with High Sensitivity, or Kids with High Sensitivity, we see that the first pillar, deep processing of information, as I said, we have an essential characteristic, is that the witness, that awareness, is very much advanced. It's very much developed. The prefrontal cortex, that is the one in charge of this type of behaviors and is not usually fully developed until the age of 18, we can see that these kids do have earlier signs of activity in this area. And this leads them to a very developed intuition, a very high sensitivity to subtle elements. And this is an important aspect because talking to families, very often I present to them the need of not lying. Kids perceive when, without telling them, you're not really telling them the truth because your facial expression was not completely right. And they ask you, they perceive clearly your mood. What's wrong, Mom? What's happened, Mom, Dad? And they want you to give them the right answer. You can't just give them, you can't just tell them, no, I'm okay, because they perceived the whole process, that intuition, and they felt something was wrong. They're very aware of that situation and that they're very sensitive to subtleness. And if we lie to them, they end up feeling that they cannot trust their intuition because their reference person is telling them that it's not necessary, that it's not right, they shouldn't be listening to it. But it does work that way. So that is very important. That intuition, the deep processing of information, generates an expectation. And these expectations of what they are observing, what they're feeling, generate a deep critical feeling. They end up being very thoughtful people of what's going on. They try to manage that load of information that they perceive. And what happens? Well, they end up being very perfectionist, where nothing can be perfectly finished because it can always be done better. And that process also leads to higher anxiety and fear to failure. And families also have a great deal with the answer they can give to their kids when they present to us our drawings. And we start telling them, oh, it's so beautiful, but look, you could have done better here. You could have put an extra door here, or the wheel should be done. We're always making comments. We can't just, wow, enjoy it. It's the drawing you've done. It's beautiful. You're so expressive, so creative. You wanted to represent this. What do you think? How did you enjoy doing it? No, we're always trying to tell them, let's draw the sun. Let's do this. Let's do that. We're trying to push them there to that perfection, and that's contagious. It's feeding that critical feeling of that of these students, and through it, that little frustration, or sometimes the huge frustration, with regards to the unfinished task. Overstimulation, that's the other pillar, also has some consequences. That radar to everything, that attention, focus, and maintained attention leads to an overload of sensitive and thought bombarding. And all this information requires more time to manage. We are trying to get with the reference framework, with an explanation framework, to certain elements that can help us identify maybe symptoms when we identify the problems, but they're not characteristics of high capacities or high sensitivity. They're an effect of roots derived from what we're telling them. This time to manage information of all this overload of information that the brain of these kids and the body of these kids receives leads them to overload very easily. So when we see them in the preschool, when there's a tantrum, apparently without any reason, when they're very excited, overexcited, or they're having a response to their behavior that is not acceptable, well, that's just a matter of, it's a way of showing that they couldn't cope with everything that was going. And the antidote for this overstimulation is to disconnect. They need quiet spaces, and we need to implement preventions activities. If we're going to a birthday party, we need to know. If we're going to change a plan of going to the cinema, but we're going to the mountain instead, they need to know, because information they receive in a change of plan, when the information they receive is huge, and they need to be able to manage it, and they choke on this overload. Intense emotions. This was another characteristic of the high sensitivity kids. What does it involve, this intense emotion? They're going to look for feelings, for new experiences, fascinating experiences. And depending on what their personality is, like if they're more extrovert or more introvert, we will see students that can be leaders, very much helpers of their colleagues, and very much loved. But if we're talking about more introvert kids, we will see that they're much more autonomous, or only relate to those kids, to very close kids or very close people to them. But the characteristic of the sensations and feelings stays there. And one of the differences between people with problems with attention deficit would be impulsiveness. And these kids don't have this impulsiveness because they are very reflective. They can be faster or slower, but definitely they do reflect of what they're doing, because they're considering the different possibilities and the consequences that their actions have. And that's a huge difference with regards to other people. But what happens with these intense emotions? That it generates certain hunger, some tension, and alerts when things are not connected properly. It activates dopamine. And this is when we enter the third block of factors that can describe to us characteristics, not with the characteristics themselves, but on how we can approach them. General award system, that dopamine. This comes in the mesolimbics and mesocortical ways and paths that go from the tegmentar area to the accumbens nucleus. And these are going to feeding these brain cells that they are using more often as their highest action possibility, they will be using dopamine. We will see a higher presence of dopamine in the whole brain area that is connected with these mesalinic ways. And these mesalinic paths that receive information from the hippocampus, from the basal ganglion, the basal node, with their plan, and they are connected with with the planning and what is being activated. The cortex, prefrontal cortex, is also activated, and these mesocortical areas are also flooded with dopamine. There are normal and abnormal situations. In normal situations, dopamine is inhibited by other substances, that is GABA, that is another neurotransmitter. But in some occasions, this would be the tonic impulses of the dopamine. It happens at a regular level, but when one memory information, one sensitive information from the external way activates these dopamine fibers, it also activates other substance, that is glutamate, that explodes in the production of dopamine in these fibers. And then the proportions of dopamine in these areas increases enormously. What is the consequence for this? Well, this has been very much studied in addiction basic mechanism. Addicted people to amphetamines, to cocaine, to alcohol, to marijuana, to a set of drugs and substances that promoted the use of dopamine and that inhibited the receivers of that dopamine, and that's why there was an addiction. In drugs, it was mainly studied, these award systems were studied because they had very much to do with dependence and addiction. But these systems are also essential when adapting the individual to the environment, because when you need to eat, when you need to drink, those basic behaviors for maintaining life, they stay persistently there because the dopamine levels are higher in your brain, because you have a very deep motivation to achieve your objective. You wouldn't be able to do that if that dopamine was not there. But it's not only in the natural stimulus of sex, food, sleep, and not the artificial either. It was studied with drugs, but also in this exploring stimulus, when what is at stake is information that does not match the models that we currently have. So challenges, novelties, these paths also work, and we have studied this very much, especially by Maria Ries in 2017 in Stockholm. And in this study, this meta-study from Gomez Leon with 42 novel articles between the relation between dopamine and giftedness. And it's not only drugs that produce this addiction. So this can explain to us very well look at this search for challenges, for novelties that we see in gifted students. We see that the stimulus, if we're talking about high capacities, the congruent information and active area of this tegmental area, it releases dopamine to the system of brain awards. And this will lead us to a pleasurable experience. It will be a positive reinforcement of this behavior. And in the future, we will try to look for this experience, repeat it, and keep it. And it will also create a model, because once we've activated dopamine, if we achieve that objective, we don't only have this pleasure while looking for information, but also when we get the acknowledgement from society, our personal acknowledgement of having achieved it, etc. And that is a very positive support and reinforcement to keep activating this path. Let's look at these works from González León in 2020 on the interaction between dopamine and high capacities. And more specifically, the relation between high sensitivity, learning capacity, and motivation. As I said, what they did was a meta-analysis in many articles that were very recent, and she was looking for certain indicators. And one of them was dopamine, high capacities, or giftedness. And they looked the relation between these learning characteristics with physiology. And she found that high capacities had learning repercussions. This adapting to the environment involves that there are some pyramidal brain cells that are faster and more efficient. This motivation for exploratory feeling that we already see in babies when they're trying to learn and observe everything and pay attention to those more abstract aspects for general population, but that they're very specific for populations with high capacities. And this is due to modular systems. And as we mentioned, this is all due to dopamine and that glutamate that we already mentioned before. This is going to produce an overload of hormones and substances in the whole blood system. And there will be the amygdala, and the hippocampus will be at stake too. And this is what is going to help them see the lack of consistency in the information that they are receiving. Another element that this analysis studies is how they are more prone to challenge. There are more connections and more synapses in their brain. We consider the cingulated cortex as another lobe, an additional lobe, and there's very much going on this part. We are talking about very deep situations in the brain, in the limbic system. And then the last element is perseverance. It relates very much, it's very much related with an early development in the mesolimbic and mesocortical pathways. These fibers become mature earlier, and there is a higher plasticity when connecting the networks, some brain cells with others, depending on the external stimulus. And this leads us to a higher supply of dopamine that shows in this perseverance. Differential characteristics that we find in these works with regards to high capacities. Well, the first one is that they interact much more with the environment. we see more exploratory behaviors and they're more motivated to by novelty. Another important element is sensitivity to the studies and the stimulus that we have perceived. And there's genetic figures and genetic elements that reinforce the process of enriching, brain enriching. And what does this mean? Well, the development of brain cells. There are many more dendrites and new brain cells. When you're walking in the forest, there are areas with more vegetation and others with less. Well, here we will just find very dense areas in their brains. Their brain, the nervous impulse is higher because there is a higher myelin concentration in these areas. So they have a faster response too. It has to do with these glia brain cells that promote the development of myelin. And then the third element for brain cell enrichment is that plasticity of the brain cell requires less saline medium to obtain a response of the brain cell. So the brain cell presents a higher synchronization between them. So they stay connected and they connect new brain cell nets. So knowledge increases and it relates not only in elements in specific areas in one area, but also in other elements that derive from this synaptic coordination. Where are we going to see all this? Well, in the dopaminergic networks, in those mesolimbic and mesocortical lines that we mentioned before. And that is where we find the thought about the characteristics of the sensitivity, attention to novelty, exploratory behaviors, and etc. When we study efficiency when noticing novelty in these students, they can easily perceive if something is out of place, if something has changed, if there's a situation where more attention is being paid. We see that there are two essential characteristics, and that is going to explain to us a very common behavior. There's a fast way of getting used to repeated stimulus. So they receive a stimulus and they store that stimulus and they recognize it and they get very easily used to that stimulus, so they can get bored much easier than other people that require much more repetition for that storage. So if we say that they get used very easily to repeated stimulus, that it's a clear thing that they want new stimulus very fast, because those new stimulus induce a higher release of that dopamine in the cortex and in the hippocampus. That feeling of pleasurable experience, that internal experience, and that internal feeling of positive reinforcement. So the preference for new stimulus, for challenge, it's almost going to turn into an addiction. They're going to feel that extra dopamine release and those pleasurable physical experiences. That system of efficiency detecting novelties will take these students to be searchers, explorers of novelties. And what do they have? What is it with these explorers? Well, an immediate consequence, they are alert more often because new information comes when the unexpected, and they have a higher curiosity. They are surprised for learning because they are in a situation where the presence of the release of catecholamines is a fact. So they want to explore further. They want to go and look for information. They can't wait. They have to do it. This has some educational involvements that I have split into. This explanatory framework that tries to compile many descriptive aspects that are usually separated and overlapped one with the others, and that we try to compile in a learning efficiency, and that we're trying to include the brain and the sensitivity and the interaction between these big groups. All this is going to take us to these involvements, these educational involvements. Some are more intuitive than others. Some seem to make more sense. And some seem to go against your intuition because it wouldn't make really sense. If we see a student that wants to learn Chinese, violin, to play the violin, they want to do robotics, they love doing crosswords, okay, that's fine, that's very intuitive because it seems okay, let's go and give him a place where he can study Chinese. I'll buy him a Rubik Cube, then I will stimulate the student with videos. Yes, you're feeding the maintenance of that system that they have, and that activation system and the presence, the release of dopamine in their brain with very positive experiences. They're going to tell you, yes, that's fine, that's perfect, but there are some other involvements that we need, because this inducement to release of constant dopamine release is addictive, and it produces a huge consumption of energy, and it wears out. And it has certain conditions, and it has negative implications too. So we have to compensate, we have to balance, and we would go to counterintuitive measures because they go against what we would think is to, if we think that we have to do is to continue feeding that dopamine producing and producing talent in these students and presenting them with novelties. Intuitive measures. Well, it is important because they have those requirements, because that's the way they are, because they need to develop them in early stages to create an academic environment that activates that dopamine. That's important. They have capacity for that, and their brain organ is prepared for that activation. That resounding environment will be very useful for them. But the counterintuitive that we were saying, yes, it's great that we have a resounding environment, but let's modulate that intensity. Let's slow it down a little bit. Let's see it a bit further in depth. In the resounding and learning environment, it's clear that if we need to activate dopamine in their brains, the first thing we need to do is to create an environment, a challenging environment. Focus their attention, keep their attention, and present that challenge forward. Then we would need to activate their brain. That would be the second step. Let's try that once the mesolimbic path is activated, let's activate the mesocortical activity. Let's not activate just dopamine. Let's also activate adrenaline with actions, with association. Develop associations of understanding that they would find fascinating in the framework of interaction. Because in this interaction, step one will stay. Attention, curiosity, and challenge will stay. And this interaction is not only going to be with learning products and materials, but also with their colleagues. That's why it's so important that in our classroom we have interactive working mechanism, cooperative working systems in pairs, in small groups. But whatever we do in the classroom, at home, in the street that has something to do with interaction, we know that would be an essential component to the associating activities that maintain the step one and keep the step two. We have to regulate challenge because we cannot give them a bigger challenge than their capacities, because that would create anxiety and frustration for work that we cannot complete. But we have to be careful for this challenge not to be too easy, because then they would be bored. Third step, it would be, if we're talking about the next step of implications, and we're talking about regulating a bit the brain awareness, brain award system, we need to slow down that hunger for knowledge, and we have to compensate it. We have to reduce it a little and compensate with inducing serotonin. And that would be the substance to create well-being, calmness, peace. This serotonin, we can find it when we have finished a task that we had thought of doing. We try not to fall in that constant perfectionism that doesn't allow you to finish to that peace and that solution that leads us to calm, to peace. And then we also had this slowing down, those counterintuitive measures. And let's see how to promote this serotonin, that neurotransmitter that will allow us to have that trust, that calmness. First thing would be to generate in them, to create an alpha brain system. We know that the brain has different states depending on the frequency of activation. Beta would be between 50 and 40 cycles per second, where brain activity is alert, to keep attention, to keep the activity. But we usually live with very high activation status in the brain, and these high states consume huge amounts of energy. If we measure energy in glucose, at the end of the day, the brain consumes 200 grams of glucose. And the body consumes 200, and the brain 175 grams just by the brain. Imagine how little we leave for our bodies. So if we're consuming too much energy for this sustained alert system, we are going to have transitional issues, but also in our organs we can end up having body deterioration due to this excess of saturation, its activation excess. That's why we need to compensate this powerful tool that high-capacity people have with some alpha states that go below 12 cycles per second, go to 8 cycles or 4 cycles per second, calm states, where there's relaxation, enjoyment, where there's not a time objective, or it's just a matter of being. In these alpha states, there would be the previous two falling to sleep, meditational states, where intuitive thought actually happens when we lower dopamine levels, we lower activation levels, is when the right combinations start, when good coding of what is relevant comes, when we start reorganizing our thoughts. It's during sleep when we organize, rearrange our learning, our daily learning, where all the networks are developed and are consolidated. And in these alpha states that we need to learn to achieve and that we have to train and to maintain, here is where we see that creativity will appear. I recommend that if we are looking at the Robert Stenberg examples, you will find them much easier. You will find solution much easier if you are calm, if you're in a relaxed way. But if you're worried to fail, if you're worried about this might mean that my self-esteem will be damaged, will be hurt, or my self-perception is going to tell me that I won't be able to do this. All this tension, all these internal and psychological, physical tensions are going to limit very much our creativity state. And it's going to be much harder for us to solve it. Very often what I do is instead of asking them to answer quickly to each of the questions, because sometimes very often they will do it wrong, they will get it wrong, I tell them, stop, think. We're not going to have time. We will have 10 minutes for each question. Don't you hurry, just enjoy reading, enjoy connecting. And when I see that they are relaxed, that they are really paying attention to what they are being asked, and they don't see and they don't consider the objective itself, that's when they think, oh, this is because of this and that. And I tell them, I do this meta-reflection later on. Think how you felt when you solved it, when you realized that it wasn't critical what was going, but what was staying. And that's in these thoughts is when they are learning, when they review what happened in their minds, in their bodies, and then they can repeat. Another essential problem of high sensitivity is overload. So during the day, we're going to need this breathing, this to avoid too many emotions, and these have to be free, without conditions. Reliefs that are going to give us trust, that are going to give us the basis to safety, to be calm, to be quiet, that alpha mental and physical state. And that connected to all this, these alpha techniques will release higher serotonin and there will be a well-being emotion there. Very often they have lost that emotion due to that hypercognitive, hyperactive state. And finally, the slow model of doing things, do things slowly, pay attention, let their brains breathe with meditation, breathing, walking. Meditation that will make our brains stop and to be present in the current moment, not to be thinking about what's happened or what will happen, but to focus on what's happening to us here and now. And we need to slow down and to produce this serotonin, and we need to practice this slowing down very much. And the best moment to stop is to slow down is to do those tasks that we are used to doing on our daily basis. So that's why we slow down. When you're drinking a glass of water, you're drinking that glass of water. You're not thinking about brushing your teeth, cooking dinner, clean the house, tidy up your clothes. anything that you're doing, you can do it slower, much slower, and you will be paying much more attention to it. We should remember that if we want to do is to reduce the thinking activity, the essential antidote is to disconnect. And you can get that through attention, that attention that is perceived in a parallel way. And through the focus allows us to be here and now. That attention is what we need to train. And if we want to fight against that overload, that waterfall of thoughts and reflection, the best thing we can do is to promote full attention in the present moment. And with this, I would finish my conference. I hope you find it useful. I hope it helps you. And I hope to have been able to share some knowledge and information when assessing this fascinating topic that is high capacities. Thank you very much to all of you.